Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Shovel Knight Specter of Torment. In the last part we went through Propeller Knight stage and got a flashback out of the way as well. And now it's time for good old Tinker Knight stage. This stage is still filled to the brim with self-destructing mice robots, conveyor belts pushing you all over the place, and even a couple of auto-scroller segments, albeit I think Specter Knight's ability set caters him better to auto-scrolling segments than Plague Knight, Shovel Knight, or King Knight combined, as the dash slash allowing you to ascend vertically helps a lot with getting screen space, getting through screen space and things like that quickly in a way that feels good. On top of that, these gear mages, you can now attack their gears outright to make them ascend, which you might have been able to do in the other two playthroughs, but if you did, it's nowhere near as useful as it is here, because now you can actually dash slash through them. With that said, let's get into Tinker Knight's bio. Before I actually say that, I should note, I know I've read, I think, the bio for each of these knights in all three playthroughs so far, I want to say. That might seem redundant, especially given they're mostly talking about the Shovel Knight campaign. The main reason I'm doing that is actually because it keeps it in line with how I think I handled Mega Man and Bass, where I read the Robot Master bios in both playthroughs of that, as well as whenever I've done a redo of an old Mega Man LP as well. I've just kind of always done that. So it just kind of keeps it in line with that and makes my brain feel happy. Let's see, Tinker Knight. Some knights love rushing into the gory battle ready to crush the skulls of their enemies. Tinker Knight is not one of those knights. He does his fighting before the battle begins, laboring on diabolical devices that do his work for him. The wrench is the tool of his trade, doubling as an engineering device and a melee weapon. Some are quick to dismiss Tinker Knight's lethality, usually just before falling victim to one of his mechanical monstrosities. Pros, he's got a gregarious demeanor, and he's a hard worker. Cons, he's got rough hands, he works long hours, and he's always have to prove himself. Now, I'd say the biggest hazard in this stage overall is these moving gear platforms. Like in the other two campaigns, they move on a rhythm. In some cases of the platforming, especially on a first run, might get tight enough that I'd recommend coming here after getting the Chronos coin, as that'll allow you to sneak through these a little more safely. Don't have to worry about stuff, and if you have that and the hover plume, you can also get through some of these platforming sections pretty quickly. That's another thing I really like about this campaign, is because the curios unlock after specific levels, there is that benefit of going through certain stages first, in the case you're having trouble with certain platforming and other stages, which in that regard actually makes this easily the closest campaign to, say, like, classic Mega Man's 2, 3, and 6 in specific, where after certain stages you would unlock certain items or rush abilities. The only thing is, because you don't know which curios will unlock after which stage on a first playthrough, that's mostly a benefit that'll come into play on a second playthrough unless you're looking up a guide beforehand, which there is an entire conversation about people who do that. I think it has a place, especially depending on the individual and how their life is, but I know a lot of people just vehemently disagree with the practice of that to begin with, and I can't exactly blame them for that. But it is definitely a benefit this game has by having a more traditional Mega Man-like stage select instead of the world map-based stage select that Shovel of Hope, Plague of Shadows, and King of Cards all have. Albeit, in terms of that, I think King of Cards probably has the best use of that, just because of how many levels are in that campaign overall. I think on my practice run I did of this game on stream, I believe this was the only Wisp I actively missed in a level itself, because I impatiently just walked past it only looking at the checkpoint to my right, or the meat to my right, and that's on me. Something else this stage does that's a little interesting, compared to specifically the Shovel Knight playthrough, is these gold gears. They were a hazard in the Shovel Knight playthrough, but they were also effectively a platform because you could pogo jump off of them. But similarly to Plague Knight, we actively have to avoid them as Specter Knight because he has no way to directly deal with them. It's not like some other hazards, even from the other playthroughs, where you can just dash slash through them. No, they are just outright damaging hazards, so avoid them at all costs. And I do like how, across the 4 different campaigns, there are hazards that get reclassified as platforms, helpful or neutral in that regard, with the different abilities. Because, again, I really do think they did a good job of making each character feel so different that even if the stage design isn't that changed in the case of, say, Plague Knight, it still feels fresh enough, just from the ability standpoint. You're like, okay, this is neat. Now, something I should note, no matter if you're playing along or not, whenever you're in your 7th stage after the Plains of Passage, keep an eye out on the red skulls as you collect them in this particular stage. Because no matter what, if you've gotten every red skull you've seen up to this point, your 80th red skull is probably going to be in your 7th stage, barring you missing more than one in a given stage, on top of the one I know I haven't collected yet in the Tower of Fate. That's intentionally, by the way, in case anyone's asked in the comments up to this point. Just keep your eyes out. You might know something a little special about number 80. Something that is pretty consistent across all 4 campaigns, though, in regards to auto-scrolling. Usually the horizontal auto-scrolling stuff isn't that bad. In my experience, the places I die the most are in the vertical auto-scrolling segments. And I can't quite tell why. I'm not sure. Maybe I have more trouble comprehending level design and catching up with it vertically than I do horizontally, or what. Maybe it's the fact I have more time to absorb what's coming up because of the wider screen ratio up to right than up to down, but I don't know. Another mechanic that I think is largely exclusive to this version of the stage, though, we actively have what I often compare to just like the mushroom platforms in Mario Bros. 1. When you stand on one platform, it lowers, and a partner platform, often further in the level design, will also do something else. Sometimes it moves left to right, sometimes it moves upwards. It really depends on the individual platform. This is what I mean where if you have the Chronos coin, using it in this level can be super helpful, as it gives you more than enough time to maneuver around, especially if you have it upgraded where its effects last longer. Like, that jump in specific never quite feels comfortable without using that. Now, if you're going for 100% and go into this stage relatively early, the next screen can be kinda rough to do, as having certain curios, like the throwing sickle around on top of some other ones, really does make it a lot easier than the way that you'd have to do that otherwise. I think I did it like that at least once, just because I had very little darkness coming into this screen. But we got a red skull right there, of course. But there's also another red skull in the screen to the left. If you use throwing sickle, you're gonna hit the switches from each other, no problem. But if you don't have that, you have to jump up there and go up and around to reach the switches in time. And it's pretty tight from my memory of the timing, but it is doable. Coming up in this block is my 80th skull. You might have noticed it had a bit of an aura around it as well as something else. That's because the 80th skull you get is always that specific skull, and if you think about why we've been collecting the skulls, you can probably guess what it's going to be from that. Though I should note, the scene that it actively triggers will not actually trigger until I think you spend 80 skulls. So in the case you've gone through the stages in certain orders, and you get that skull but still haven't spent 80 by the time you do your next spending of red skulls, you're gonna need to wait until after the next stage to get a curio that'll allow you to spend up to 80. It's a little awkward in that regard. In fact, that happens in this very playthrough. But worth noting all the same, in the case you maybe did certain stages earlier, you might have a scene happen before it happens for me. Something I really need to experiment around with on my next playthrough of any of the first 3 campaigns, not so much King of Cards for reasons, is breaking more checkpoints along the way. Because the only time I've actively broken checkpoints when it's not been on accident, because that has happened at least on a couple of occasions, is when I was going for the 100% stuff in Shovel of Hope, as I'm cautious and paranoid enough about my ability to die in stupid ways, where it's never really worth it for me to break the checkpoints along the way, but I do think the money they give you if you break a checkpoint is worth enough that it can really change how you shop for things throughout a campaign, especially if it has more things to buy, like specifically Shovel Knight's playthrough, or probably Plague Knight's playthrough even. It doesn't really matter nearly as much in Specter Knight's run, because Specter Knight's run, partially because I think it has the fewest amount of stages, period, across the 4 campaigns, it just feels like the amount of things there are to buy on top of the money you get, you just are probably going to be the most financially set in this playthrough compared to the other ones, so there's no real additional bonus in my eyes to actively break the checkpoints. This is the vertical autoscroller I was talking about earlier, by the way. If you rush too much, that can actually be pretty tough because you might overshoot a jump and just fall back down to the now bottomless pit below you, so watch out in that section. With that said, it's time for Tinker Knight.
What are you, some kind of ghost? Get out of my shop. I have work to do.
The Enchantress would like a word. We have an army to raise, and talented engineers are in short supply.
Ha! You may be a tool, but I am not. Time to make short work of you.
Alright, like usual, we have Tinker Knight himself here. He actually gets to do a little more in this particular playthrough even compared to Plague Knight, as like with Shovel Knight, we don't have a way to instant kill this phase. He'll throw wrenches at you that are pretty easy to dodge, and he'll make his little gear that's actually the sub-weapon Shovel Knight gets in this stage raise up to be a giant spike barrier that you need to jump on the wall and jump over him to get past, on top of dashing into him. He does move back and forth like that a little bit, but eventually he'll slam into the opposite wall, at which point he will lower back down, so watch out for that. Thankfully, I don't think those spikes are technically instant death. Like with every other fight against Tinker Knight, though, we're not done, but they do give you a health restore at this point. It's time to fight the Tinker Tank itself. And this fight's a little different because unlike other fights against him, he actively stays on a gear platform in the distance and will move between the left and right sides of the screen every couple of hits. You can stay on the drill of the Tinker Tank to hit him nice and easily, but otherwise the attacks aren't that different. He can fire missiles out of the shoulder, he can charge forward, there's a giant ball that comes out of the Buster Cannon on the left side. It's overall easy here, but there is a lot more threat of death in this particular phase. Oh yeah, there's also the missile platforms, because there's bottomless pits across the bottom of the floor, as you can see. If you're good about combo jumping and using the hover plume, in some cases you can get back to the Tinker Tank pretty quickly. But this can be surprisingly tense if you just make a wrong jump or get knocked back by a certain projectile into a pit. That's usually why I save this particular stage for later in a given playthrough this, as I'll just be better prepared for anything it could throw at me. Lewin, help! Who goes there? You have sealed your fate. Your friend has fallen, and your own life is forfeit. Unless you do as I command, I shall grant you a reprieve from certain death, and give you great power. I gather I don't have a choice then. Fine. I'm listening. You will gather me a grand army. The knights of this land will bow before me. You will bring them here, and I will have a fearsome order. If that's your price, then so be it. I bind you with this enchanted locket. When 8 knights kneel before me, it will gain the power to restore life. I will do as you wish. Ah, yes. Go now, my Specter Knight, and sow fear throughout my empire. Donovan being Specter Knight's kind of a no-shit Sherlock moment given the similar stance, moveset, and everything during those flashback sequences, but the circumstances that caused it to happen truly are tragic, especially given what we know from the main campaign, where Shield Knight was just completely right. Alright, time for probably my least used sub-weapon overall, the Barrier Lantern. You use it, it generates a fire-based Mega Man shield for several seconds at a time. At first, the fire is kind of small, but it does grow larger over time. It can protect you from even certain environmental hazards like lava. You can also press the button again to fire it forward like certain other Mega Man shields, in which case it'll actually do large damage and some big explosion effects that can even stick around for a little bit. It's not the worst. I just don't really tend to use it, and that's probably also because since I tend to do Tinker Knight stage relatively late in, I just get it so late in the campaign it doesn't really get a chance to do much. I'm immediately gonna go and upgrade that. I believe when it's fully upgraded, the fires can get larger, they'll do more damage, and I think the explosion effect might also be larger. It definitely does more damage across the tin, though. And to my memory, it's not too bad, especially in certain boss fights. It's just, again, because of how late I get it, it doesn't really get time to shine. Probably the next time I play through this on my own time, I'm going to try and do this stage a little earlier so I can see exactly how useful this is in the long term. All right, Tinker Knight, what you got going on up here?
Tools of war can force a kind of peace, but I think our rules should be fair and just. None but fools would break things and not rush to fix them.
How weirdly reasonable of you. If anything, I think Tinker Knight is potentially the knight I'm kind of sad we don't learn too much about throughout the games. Like, him and Propeller Knight, I think, have very interesting personalities, and especially the implied history with Propeller Knight, that I wish we got to learn more about. So I just picked up the last of the cloaks, by and large. The Raiment of Risk. That's an interesting one that I think is very well suited for a New Game Plus playthrough, especially if you're trying to do New Game Plus and breaking all the checkpoints at once. Because what it does is that it replaces the treasure within a breakable checkpoint with a yellow crystal, at least the first one you find in a stage. When you grab that, it reduces your health back down to the default 4 pips that Specter Knight starts the game with. But it makes your darkness meter slowly regenerate, meaning you don't need to worry about enemy drops for darkness and sub-weapon usage throughout the rest of that stage until you die. And it also makes it so that your default slashes and charge slashes, although you can't exactly do a charge slash like that, will now fire a projectile forward, sort of like the max health laser beams in the Zelda games. It doesn't do that on a dash slash though, but that means you have a very interesting toolkit to play with in a stage. It does reset when you die, but it's not a permanent loss in that stage all the same, because while that checkpoint you broke is still going to be broken, that tile is not supposed to be there. The next checkpoint you find will have that crystal in it again, so you can get it upwards of 5, 6, 7 times per stage if you're dying really badly. Albeit that does mean you're going back even further in the stage in most cases as well. It's interesting, but I wouldn't say it's very beginner-friendly because, again, you need to break the checkpoint, which, as I mentioned earlier in this very video, I have only really done, barring accidental times, when either experimenting with this specific armor or going for the Shovel Knight 100% playthrough stuff for the trophies. For now, though, it's time for the final of the Order of No Quarter stages. This is Propeller Knight. His bio, this aerodynamic ace commands the Enchantress's flying machine with a cocksure attitude of a sky pirate. With his heli helmet, he can zoom short distances with ease. Shovel Knight encounters Propeller Knight on top of the aircraft as it zooms through the sky. Earth fights against air in a true battle of the elements. Pros, he's a talented fencer. He's got his mechanical heli helmet, and he's rather debonair. Cons, he's rather arrogant, he's kind of a lightweight, and he's got an outrageous accent. So this stage has a lot of bottomless pits to begin with, but the major mechanic we're going to be contending with throughout it, with Specter Knight in specific, is twofold. For one thing, there's these little Mandragora enemies that will float up and down for you to dash slash through over bottomless pits. You can also do that to any of the cannonballs from the prior 2 playthroughs. But also, we got these blue platforms that will collapse the moment you stand on them. These were in the Shovel of Hope and Plague of Shadows campaign, but I believe off the top of my head they're only in the Tower of Fate stages. If they're in Propeller Knight stage, I've just completely forgotten about them. Also, it's worth noting, I have had several takes in this video I've ended up cutting out because I kept on calling Tinker Knight, specifically Clockwork Knight. And I get why, it's the Clockwork Tower, but I haven't touched the game Clockwork Knight 1 or 2 in years, so I don't know why I keep trying to say that almost. Weird. Like with the prior 2 campaigns, something to keep a note about the wind mechanics present in this stage, specifically whenever it's from propeller enemies like this or fans on the ground. Momentum actively matters for them. If you jump up high and then fall into the wind, you'll fall down lower, which is how we got to an earlier Red Skull in the stage. But also, if you jump up out of them, you will get flung up higher if you start at a lower point. There's not many times that really comes into play, but it's worth knowing all the same because that could be information that saves you from a bottomless pit death in a lot of cases. You can also slash through the cannonballs, like I said, but you actually do need to literally physically attack the cannonballs moving towards you in some cases to get through without getting messed up and falling into bottomless pits. The foreground elements they use to obscure some platforms here, I've never cared for this mechanic myself, but I think this is an okay variation of it because I think Shovel Knight's art style and space is readable enough where it's never really that big of a problem. It's when there's either a lot of critical information hidden from you or there's several layers of obscuring happening that I just don't like it. Hi, Castlevania Bloodlines Endgame. I immediately think of you whenever I say that. Because even though I know that section relatively well, it's not that bad. I'll never forget the first playthrough where I died way too many times at that particular stage. If you know, you know. Now, to talk about the soundtrack again, I mentioned before that they gave each of the songs a new mix that's either a slower or higher tempo to better reflect the mood of the world at this point in time. And largely, I think the soundtrack works, but for some reason, specifically with this song and like one other, it feels like they just removed some instruments and the songs feel less interesting to listen to because of it. Like, I actively don't like this cover of, I actually forget the name of this song outright, but the Propeller Knight stage, which is a shame too because the actual Propeller Knight theme from the main campaign is one of my favorite songs in that game. So this being as low-key as it is to a point of feeling empty just feels off. I also think out of all the main Order of No Quarter stages, and partially maybe just because I usually do this one last in the Shovel of Hope and Plague of Shadows campaigns, this one got particularly truncated in the Specter Knight conversion, because there's some mechanics that are only present for one screen here that were very annoying and much more present in the first two campaign variants of the stage. Namely, we've already seen there's a bit of a wind mechanic going on, in fact here it is again. In the first two campaigns, there's several screens where there's wind that will push you right and push you up. And they will actively alternate between that in a way that's pretty interesting to get around. In this campaign, that's not really present. Oh, I missed that jump, so time to fall into this red skull and die. The timing on those jumps is tighter than it looks, but it's not as tight as you might think it looks at the same time, if that makes sense. Like, you do actively have to try to make those jumps, but it's not pixel perfect like I thought it would be on my first run. Alright, only missing one more skull in this stage. You may have noticed, actually, the skull on the gear menu is now swapped over to that unique one we got back in Tinker Knight stage. Again, that happens at your 80th skull. Any skulls you collect after that are technically optional, and really the only point to doing so would be to get 100% on your save file, as well as, I believe, get a feat/trophy directly connected to the skulls themselves. Yeah, this is the only actual screen in the stage that has the wind mechanic I was talking about that would push you right and up and all that jazz. And I think they do some interesting stuff with it thanks to the dash slash, but I feel like they could have done more with this particular mechanic out of all the ones from the base campaigns. Something I do find funny about this stage, though, specifically in every campaign outside of Shovel of Hope, these propeller enemies, their entire deal is getting close to you and then using their propellers to try to blow you backwards in the bottomless pits and all that. Every other knight has an easier time dealing with them than Shovel Knight, with at least just the base attacks. Because Specter Knight's physical attack as well as the charge just has better range than Shovel Knight's, for instance. Plague Knight has the throwables and all that. King Knight's entire playstyle is kind of just a giant middle finger to their playstyle to begin with, their attack style to begin with, rather. Like, if you're not using Curios as Shovel Knight, those enemies suck. But every other character has a much easier time dealing with them in a way I honestly find kind of funny. With that said, we're already getting towards the end of the stage, and I love this background. I forget if I mentioned this during the Shovel Knight and Plague Knight playthrough, but this is one of my favorite backgrounds in the game. I love pixel art sunsets. I think they're so gorgeous. And it'll always take me back to Tomahawk Man stage in Mega Man 6, because I think that's one of the best backgrounds in classic Mega Man, period. Now, if there's one thing I recommend having for this fight, it's the Dread Talon and the Hover Plume in the case you're a little more reckless with your jump and placements and all that. Oh, such tattered robes. Are you here to join the galley crew, then? Magnificent! On the contrary, you shall join us. An alliance of elite knights will surely complement your carefree crew. As the captain of the Enchantress's flagship, the skies will belong to your rivals no more. Rivals? Me? Never! I'll cast you overboard! Hope that your blade is better honed than your sense of style. On guard! Alright, Propeller Knight starts about the same as he does in the other campaigns. He's gonna jump left and right doing stabs with his rapier in the meanwhile. But I like the other two campaigns we've already done, where the cannonballs fire from the background make holes in the platform. Now they just outright destroy it, and we have to use other airships to platform and hit him all the same. He's still gonna be doing his stabs during all this. If he falls into the bottomless pit, he'll just spawn back at the top. He can pull and push you using the propeller on his head. He can drop bombs from the ship in the background as well, but depending on where the placement of the platforms are to begin with, those aren't that big of a threat. Because of the close quarters the ships can create, though, as you can see, you can melt through his health bar really quickly, even compared to some of the other bosses. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 7, we're heading towards Endgame. See you guys then.